Hello, everyone. As Colin introduced me, I'm Hugh Monahan. I'm the co-founder of Stellar Jockeys, and I'm also the designer. We started in 2011, and June of this year, we released our first title, Brigador. And as some of you may have heard or read, or as indicated by the title, our launch wasn't exactly sterling. So I'm going to do a little bit of a primer on the game itself and then just kind of run through some of the conclusions that I came to once I kind of got over the initial mourning period of a bad launch. So let's start out with what's Brigador? Quick question, actually. Excluding this talk, or like finding out about this talk, how many of you knew about this game? Oh, you guys are nice. So that's actually way above average. Now, of that group who were familiar with it, did you find out about, how many of you found out about it because of me running my mouth on the internet? Okay, about half of you. Yeah, so we'll get into that later. So Brigador, the quick spiel is it's an isometric tactical combat game. You drive around a mech, top down, you blow stuff up. It's a Kool-Aid Man simulator is kind of our internal narrative for it. So we built an engine from scratch. Part of that was because we started in 2011 and the engine landscape was very different then. Part of that is because the deal with the programmers who were on our team at the time was that they get to write their own engine. So it's like, okay, let's do it. And this actually gelled pretty well with some of the core fundamentals for us going into developing a game was that we wanted to explicitly make something that was different. And we wanted to make something that had a very high skill ceiling. And the problem is that working within existing engine frameworks, you can still do that within those, but my brother often says game engines are often like wood in that they have a grain to them. And so based on the thing that you are using, the tool, the engine that you're using, there's going to be a natural flow, a natural kind of way to work with it. And so building your own engine actually does provide a little bit more of a flexibility there, although of course it also has extreme drawbacks. As part of this kind of building something different and unique, we used sprite rendering style. The idea was part of it was just pipeline reasons. We only had one artist who did every single art asset on the game. But the reason why we stuck with sprite-based was both production standpoint and from the idea of kind of taking that style and bringing it forward to modern processing. There's a lot of things that you can actually do with sprite rendering, with lighting, with using ZFNATs. Again, I'm not going to get too technical, but it's a style that hasn't really been used much, and we wanted to kind of bring that forward. Some other thing that was really nice was we worked with a group called Makeup and Vanity Set. Could not have been happier with that experience, and we actually doubled down on the music that we had him produce. But a kind of bright side of that was that, right now we're rated, like PC Gamer had us listed as one of the top soundtracks in games this year. So like a lot of these things are kind of interesting, going well. Our Metacritic scores ranged from 90% all the way down to 40%. Most of them hover in like the 70 to 80% range. We actually finally landed at the end right at 70% thanks to that very last 40%. That was our last review that we got on Metacritic. So thank you, random Russian guy. I can't even pronounce his name. So that was okay, a higher Metacritic would have been nice. But on the Steam end, things were great. So we are standing at 94% positive user reviews. We've been that way pretty much stable since about the second month of launch. And if you remove negative reviews based on issues that we have since fixed since we launched, That would have brought us up to about 97, 98%, the hallowed, overwhelmingly positive rating. So there's a lot of things that, like, on paper were going well. The problem is that, as of right now, 5 months out of release, we are still below 10K units sold, and we are very much in the red. And the question is why? And it turns out, when something goes wrong, your immediate instinct is to blame everyone else. I was perfect. I'm a great designer, great company leader. Like, nothing I could have done wrong. Well, not entirely true. There were some things that were outside of our control, but a lot of these things were actually not even just the launch itself, but the way that we kind of worked into the launch, the way we presented the game prior to that. So just real quick for context, this was our launch trailer for early access. So at the time, we thought that was a pretty good trailer, and it's kind of fun to watch. It's 45 seconds long. You kind of zip right through it. The problem is that looks like a twin-stick shooter, and Brigador is anything but a twin-stick shooter. And what we found is that, so going into making those trailers, we did all the trailers ourselves. The idea was that we were just going to use raw footage. We weren't going to do any like smoke and mirror stuff. We weren't going to do any like pre-rendered cutscenes or anything. It was just going to be, let's show the gameplay, let the gameplay sell the game, and go from there. The problem is that for some games, Brigador included, the subjective experience of playing the game is totally different from what it just looks like watching a video of gameplay or watching someone else play it. And in our case, when you're actually playing Brigador, it feels much slower than that. And it's much more like, it's very intensive. Whereas here, it looks like just real fast-paced twin-stick shooter. You kind of pop around, shoot stuff. We did, just part of this harkens back to our heavy focus on destructibility and terrain. We wanted the player to actually be really creative in the way that they interact with the environment and in the way in which they kind of progress through these levels. Like when I say like fully destructible environments, we built the game around this idea that we don't do any gating. Like that's not, like Red Faction was great, but it had an issue where it's like, okay, the entire world is destructible except for the room with the guy that you got to get. And then, like they would just gate you through these specific checkpoints. And we wanted to have the game from the ground up kind of respect this idea of destructibility. The problem is that because we didn't properly prime our audience, we had all these twin-stick shooter players look at Brigador and be like, oh, it's a twin-stick. And then they would either buy it or play it or get some footage of it. And then they would come away surprised and often disappointed because, well, this isn't what the game that I was sold. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we had all these people who should have been our core audience. These guys who like kind of more hardcore, like people who wanted this kind of mech warrior style tactical combat, who took one look at this game and like, oh, it's just a twin stick. I don't want to play that. And so just from this simple fact of, and like, we've been working on this game for years, we were knee deep in it, and we thought that those trailers were like, those elements of the game were self-evident. But it turns out it was totally the opposite. And the problem is because this game looked close enough to sort of existing tropes or existing kind of genres of gameplay that a lot of what was creative and unique and different about Brigador got completely wiped by this instinctive, like you look at it, oh, it's a twin stick. And then people fail to see any nuance and like we didn't convey any of that. As a counterexample, Duskers, I think, is one of the best games in recent times that has properly primed their audience. So, if anyone doesn't know Duskers, you're a dude in a spaceship, or a person in a spaceship, you're sending drones into derelicts, and you control it using a command prompt. And if you are familiar with the trailers, with how they marketed it, and also just with the initial experience of playing that game, they do an excellent job of preparing the player for what that gameplay experience is. And it starts from the very first time you see any press footage for that game. Thumper is another excellent example, of course. Thumper's getting a lot of love tonight. So this actually factors into another thing, which is controls are extremely important. So Brigador actually is so it's an isometric shooter, but we built it around tank controls. To clarify, W goes forward based on the orientation of your vehicle, as opposed to up on the screen. Now, there are a few games recently that have used this style of control scheme, but it's fairly rare. It used to be much more prevalent in the 90s. We thought this wouldn't be a problem. And it turns out, we actually did a lot of play testing, and with people who did come into it, the issue is that we only presented them with the option of, okay, like you're coming in to test this game, here's the control scheme for it. And we found it would take people, some people just took to it like a fish to water. Some people took 30 to 60 minutes. But once they got it, once they clicked, oh man, this is great. It's like a really interesting control scheme, love it. We had, prior to ship, like actually from a very early stage, we had a twin stick style control scheme where we used the AI to sort of readjust, like interpret the player's movements so that they could play it like a twin stick. So, W is up or like on a controller. And I took it out, which was probably one of the biggest mistakes leading into launch. And the rationale in my mind for this was that I set up a false dichotomy. It's like, if you're going to play Brigador, I want you to play it in the best possible way. And the best possible way is to learn tank controls and then allow it to click. The problem is that takes time. And a lot of people, if you present them with any kind of a steep learning curve, they're just going to bounce right off of it. And in my mind, it was, okay, they're either going to, given the game, they're just going to learn the control scheme. When in reality it was, they're given the game with this control scheme that they're not familiar with, so they just don't play it. And they would either return it or, just have a bad experience and then get in an argument with me on the internet. And the thing is, I was right in that, no, you should play it with tank controls, but it turns out that someone playing your game in a way that they enjoy it is far more important than trying to push the player into what is, quote, in your mind, an ideal way of playing the game. So this is not Brigador statistics, but it's a game that is more popular but suffered similar issues with control and complexity. 17% of their players dropped out within basically half an hour of touching the game. And staggeringly, 92% dropped out before completing the first dungeon area, or first level set, which is about roughly 2 hours of gameplay. And this is a game that you could play at least 10 hours, possibly more. 92%. And also, these numbers are somewhat depressed due to being part of a PS Plus giveaway, but it's still this kind of similar scope. The majority of players for your game, which is the people that fund your development, are never going to make it past those initial stages of gameplay. And this was devastating to me. Now, admittedly, these statistics are going to be more severe with any kind of game that is more mechanically oriented. I think linear narrative-driven games, or games where it's specifically you have this guided story, tend to be stickier with the player base. I'm still working on building up proper statistics to back this up, but what I've seen so far, especially games that are shorter play length, don't suffer the same level of attrition. But this, from what I've seen, this is pretty common. This devastating statistic is pretty common for mechanical games. And I completely failed to consider that. When I was designing Brigador, everything from difficulty to the control scheme, what in my mind was sort of middle-of-the-road gamer was okay, this is someone who's going to put 4 or 5 hours in. Most of the people who come into this game are going to play long enough for it to click and are going to see kind of the bulk of what the game has to offer. When in reality, we had all these people come in and they're presented not only with a control scheme that takes 30 minutes to an hour to learn, not even let alone get comfortable with, but also because we have a game that is different and complicated and has a unique control scheme, that learning curve was so steep, we also had to do a crap ton of tutorialization. So it meant that your first hour of play on Brigador was faced with, okay, cool little intro segment, and then tutorials. And the problem was that in order to get the player, in my mind, up to speed, like up to a level of competency to really enjoy the game, that's what we needed to do, kind of fast track them through all this info. But it turned into just walls of text. And again, we just kind of built that wall higher and higher for players to be able to scale, the higher that players needed to scale in order to stick with the game. So speaking of complexity and all these things, I hear you whisper in the back, what about Dark Souls? And I spent a lot of time thinking about this because Dark Souls, like Demon Souls, Dark Souls, that whole franchise actually shares a lot of the things, I'm not banging comparison with Brigador and Dark Souls, but this idea that it's a very difficult game. It's a game that mechanically is fairly unique. And it's a fairly steep learning curve. There's a lot of stuff. You have to really get a player to commit to that. The difference, besides them being a large studio and having a much more sizable marketing budget, is that From Software, by the time they even made Demon Souls, they had already had this long pedigree of making games that are different or mechanically challenging. They essentially built up an audience for these types of games, as well as an expectation that, oh, these are the types of games that From Software makes. And as a result, they did a very good job of essentially laying the groundwork for people to make it, to hurdle through these obstacles, to provide the impetus for players to play the game until it clicked. They had that all set up before day one of development on Dark Souls. So yeah, just kind of recap. The way I think of it is that doing something different, something unusual or complicated or having a high difficulty, these things can still be great. And I think some of the most compelling games, at least for me personally, are ones that combine all three of these. The problem is that as a developer, you have to very carefully consider how those are going to affect your users and also how you are going to prime them and kind of provide a kick for them to overcome what are much more significant obstacles to start enjoying your game. This was floating around on Reddit a couple months back. It's a quote from an October 2000 review of Alien Resurrection, basically talking about how crazy it was that it was the first game that used this kind of twin stick style control scheme on a first person shooter. You know, left stick is moving and strafing, right stick is aiming. You know, blows everyone's mind. And so the header is, game developers should never ever be afraid to innovate. And I think that's a great sentiment, but the reality is that innovating is extremely dangerous from a financial and like kind of building a company standpoint. You have to be very careful if you're doing something different, because if you don't properly engage your audience, if you don't give them a way in, then if you're doing weird and different things, you're going to come up with all kinds of roadblocks. There's going to be a lot more issues that you normally wouldn't have to deal with, because most games, if they iterate at all, they're building upon this very strong foundation of other games that are like it. So you can make an interesting first-person shooter that maybe has a twist on mechanics, like, oh, the jump jet goes this way, not that way. And anyone who comes to their game, you can rely on the majority of your players having at least experienced some kind of a first-person shooter prior to coming to your game. There's a sort of legacy knowledge. If you're building something truly unique, you don't have that legacy knowledge to tap into. Total change of subject. So this is a game, some of you may have heard of it, Slaughtering Grounds. Most famous for the company having a tiff with Jim Sterling, and for later, Digital Homicide, suing Valve and some of their reviewers. This is very interesting, specifically because, by all accounts, this is a game that shouldn't do well. So it released in 2014, costs $1, score rank 4%, user score 35. From all outward measurements, this is not a very good game. And I'm not trying to make any like concrete statement about it. I don't know those guys. I don't even care really. The point is that this is a $1 game that has sold 240-some thousand copies. And that was devastating. I didn't, it took me a while to wrap my head around that, just in that this is a game that it makes no sense that it sold that many copies. Like why, I mean, there are other $1 games even that are probably far better. Why are all these people buying this game? And the conclusion I came to is that visibility is king. So no matter how good your game is, people can't buy it if they don't know it exists. And building something where you can engage an audience in some fashion. Now, there are ways to do that with the game itself, and there are ways to do that outside of the game. But at the end result, just having eyeballs on what you have created is one of the most important things you can do. Because with any product, you're going to have an adoption rate, right? So like say 1 in 1,000 people who see this game are going to want to buy it. Well, if you only get 1,000 people to see your game, you're screwed. So any game, any product that you create is going to be subject to that ratio, to some form of that ratio. And it's just a question of how many people you can get that in front of. So yeah, I realize I'm out of time, but I'll just run through these. So kind of the conclusion I came to with Brigador is that it's important to prime your audience for the type of game that you've made and also the type of gameplay. It's not up to you how players enjoy your game. And providing the broader of a bandwidth you can provide for how players interact with your game, so long as they're enjoying it, who cares? Like if they paid for it, if they're playing it, they're going to eventually tell their friends about it, or maybe they did something really weird or they modded it, and it's not what you intended, but that pays the bills. Most players only see your first couple of levels, especially if you're doing a mechanically complicated game. And that's fine, but just you need to plan for that. And that's why, I'm not saying, don't just like abandon the end game. Because, hardcore play, like guys that do put in 250 hours on your game, they're important in their own way. But you have to be very careful about those first couple, even minutes, but especially like the first half hour, hour of engagement. And then the more unusual, complicated, and difficult your game is, the harder it is to get people to buy in. And especially a combination of all those three. And it's possible to overcome that, but you need to be cognizant of that in the first place in order to overcome it. And we were not, we were completely blindsided by it. And last, visibility is king. All right, that's it. Thanks, guys.